part.
Carlos, I think we should wait for some time as new participants are now entering, and I think it's good to wait a few minutes.
Sure. Hello to everybody. I'm very happy to welcome you as the moderator of this webinar. My name is Carlos Lopez. I'm professor at the Mandela School of Public Governance, the University of Cape Town. And I'm very pleased to be moderating a panel that is quite outstanding in terms of experience, exposure, both to scholarly work on the issues that we are going to cover, but also on policy experience. I would like to invite first Richard Kozul-Wright to give an introduction. He's the organizer of this webinar series managed by UNCTAD. And I think it would be good for him to give us a context of how this webinar is evolving in terms of contributing to the discussions that started in a previous one and will continue forward in a series that he will present to us. Richard, you have the floor. I think we have lost Richard. While we wait for Richard to reconnect, I'm going to take the advantage of these few minutes to just introduce him more formally. Richard is the director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division at UNCTAD. He is a widely published author on issues relating to industrialization and trade. He has published on economic issues in different journals, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, the Journal of Development Studies, Oxford Review of Economic Policy, and has recently published a book on new multilateralism for shared prosperity, what him and the co-author that published the book with him called the Geneva Principles for a Global Green Deal. As you know, the Global Green Deal is very much in everybody's mouth. It has become very topical as a way of responding to the imperatives of climate transition, but also because of the pandemic acceleration of a certain number of macro phenomena. And these megatrends are very well captured in this book that has been a contribution waiting to appear. And that is going to give us a bit of an angle that is not very common, trying to see how the institutional frameworks for multilateralism should be revisited. And that's what Kevin Gallagher and Richard have offered us in this book. I see that Richard is still not with us. I'm sure that is technical issue. maybe while we wait for Richard, oh no, here I have an indication that he may be joining us soon.
He has joined. He has rejoined.
Richard, I was just introducing you. You missed the introduction of yourself, but I'm sure that you don't need that. So let me just give you the floor to present the webinar series.
Sorry about that, Carlos. My computer froze. I don't want to take a lot of time because we have a crowded agenda and a lot of people, I think most of whom others want to listen to rather than me. This is the third in the series that we've organized on industrial policy, drawing on the handbook on industrial, the Oxford Handbook on Industrial Policy that myself and Akebi and Hajun Chang and Chris Kramer edited, and using the upcoming UNCTAD 15 conference as a pretext to discuss these issues. And those two are, I think, connected in important ways, particularly by a recognition that we can't continue with a kind of business as usual agenda, given the challenges that we are facing, and in particular, that we do need transformative change across a whole series of issues, many of which will be under discussion in UNCTAD 15 in October. And this was, of course, true before COVID-19. This COVID-19 has emphasized and accelerated a number of these challenges, but they were there before. This Sustainable Development Goals were already stalling before COVID-19 hit. The climate crisis was clearly becoming more intense before COVID-19. The technological divide was growing, I think there was a recognition that this fed into a whole set of challenges around, particularly for developing countries, around the struggles to diversify their economies. That has been part of the development agenda now for decades, of course, but again has intensified in recent years. And the people on today's panel are, of course, experts on these issues, and I don't want to go into them. The challenges around the middle income trap, the issues around premature deindustrialization, the question of whether global value chains have triggered a race to the bottom, the hollowing out of the middle class, etc. All these are problems that are linked to these long-standing concerns about the need for some kind of transformative change to deal with these. And I think the industrial policy question is very much at the heart of this question of the kind of transformative agenda that we need to be in place to address these ongoing challenges. And I think in recent years, and certainly the work that we've been doing in UNCTAD, it's no longer a question of the need for industrial policy. That seems to now be recognized as a necessary part of the development policy toolkit. But whether we can do industrial policy in a hyper-globalized world, that's a question, whether the rules of the game really allow us to undertake the kinds of policies needed for transformative change. And if we can still do it, how can we do it? And obviously the question of China being able to transform itself dramatically over the last 2 or 3 decades has raised the question of the how. But also and many countries feel that if we can't do it, given the structures and rules of the hyperglobalized world, what kinds of reforms do we need particularly to the multilateral system to be able to undertake effective industrial policy to deal with the various challenges that we face. And so in that context, I think it's very much, IP is not just, the discussions around industrial policy are not just technocratic discussions, but they're very central to this large debate about the kind of future that we need, the kind of future that we want. It focuses on the role of the bigger question about the ideas that we need to reform our economies, the kinds of institutions that we need to be able to implement these kinds of policies, both state and non-state institutions, and of course, and often neglected, the kinds of interests that need to be mobilized to support industrial policy, and the kinds of interests that are in place that often block industrial policy and will need to be challenged. And I think all those are issues that are addressed in one way or another in many of the chapters of the handbook that we put together, and they're certainly very much on our minds as we go into UNCTAD 15. I guess in the particular case of these are, I think, questions facing Africa. They're channeled at the moment, of course, through the question of the continental free trade area for Africa and the role of industrial policy in affecting the free trade area, and I guess that will be an important part of the discussion coming up. And I don't want to take time up on the contributions that we're going to listen to. Just to say that UNCTAD is very much interested in participating in those discussions about the free trade area. We do understand that you can't have an effective free trade area amongst 55 countries without linking trade and issues around trade liberalization to industrial policy and the need for an integrated approach to that challenge. We recognize and have long argued that the liberalization agenda tends to move much more quickly than problems around structural transformation, and that raises all kinds of questions around sequencing and coordination that will be central to that discussion. And of course, that we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that we're operating in an international trading system where the WTO and various bilateral agreements do impede on the ability to affect the right kinds of policies to make sure that the initiative in Africa does deliver in terms of diversification, industrial development, jobs, etc. So we very much look forward to today's discussion, and let me just thank all the participants in advance for taking the time to agree to discuss these issues. We do think they are important in themselves, and they're certainly important for us as we move into our own negotiations for UNCTAD over the coming years. So thanks for that, Carlos.
Thank you, Richard. If it was about 10 years ago, I would have said this is a group of like-minded participants when it comes to industrial policy. But today, industrial policy has become almost mainstream, and it has been accepted as the way to go in a number of very important instances. International organizations have moved quite a bit. And of course, the African Union has taken the lead when it comes to implementing its regional agenda through this free trade area. And I think everybody is quite surprised with the momentum that has been set over the last few years. And it's partly the result of a political mobilization on industrialization. And that was the sort of the click that allowed for an acceleration of the discussions when it came to the African Union. And now with the free trade area established since 2017, the negotiations have been completed, the launching of the free trade area, and now the ratification level that is quite high. We can say that the momentum has been kept and people are now moving into the how more forcefully. So it would be interesting for us to listen to the Secretary General of the CFTA Secretariat, Wamkele Mene. His own career has been very much on the trade front as a negotiator and a prominent official of the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa. He has a background himself on issues that are very much related to economic development through trade and industrialization. So he's very much part of this like-minded group, as I mentioned. And he has unfortunately been forced to travel. So he will not be with us, but he has kindly recorded a video where he gives us a message about what his priorities are, and then we'll take it from there. So let me ask our colleagues from UNCTAD just to put the video so we can listen to Amkelemene. There is no sound. We need the sound. I'm sure you are addressing the issue.
That's right.
Just don't want people to think
Thank
that.
you for inviting me to this webinar on how transformative industrialization and the implementation of the AfCFTA, how it can stimulate Africa's sustainable development post-COVID-19. It is a matter of deep concern to all of us that COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on Africa's economy. While we continue to quantify the impact of COVID-19, it is worth mentioning that the pandemic pushed Africa into its first recession in over 25 years in the year 2020. And this happened when the continent had experienced a steady and unprecedented economic growth since the early 2000s. It must be noted, however, that the preceding growth continued to be characterized by high levels of inequality and unemployment. The rural population and urban poor, women and youth did not benefit from that economic growth of the 2000s. For the benefits of growth to be shared by all, there needs to be a structural transformation of Africa's economy. In this regard, industrialization is crucial for African countries to transform their economies, be able to produce value-added goods, and promote trade through greater integration into regional and global value chains. The AfCFTA is not just an instrument to promote intra-Africa trade, but also it's an important development tool to lift out of poverty millions and millions of Africans. It remains the most important development in our quest to achieve the Africa we want, consistent with the objectives and goals of the African Union Agenda 2063. Africa has to industrialize to create jobs. We have a young population, a fast-growing young population. We have a continent of 1.3 billion people, which is the second highest of any region after Asia. If there are no productive jobs for young Africans who enter the job market, the fight against poverty will be lost, and the most important determinant of whether someone is in poverty or not is having a job. Africa's industrialization policies rest on manufacturing due to multiplier effect on other sectors of the economy. Manufacturing remains the engine of growth that enhances higher levels of productivity and greater technical change, thus creating more jobs with higher wages for young people. Article 3 of the agreement establishing the AfCFTA provides for the promotion and establishment of industrial development through diversification and regional value chain development, agricultural development, and food security. This is imperative given the low levels of investment in industrial production, which is also a major contributor to the low percentage of intra-Africa trade. Africa has 16.7% of the global population and fastest growing middle class, but only accounts for 2.1% of global trade and 2.9% of the world's GDP. This is the sad reality that we must confront. And this is, however, also an opportunity with the entry into force of the AfCFTA to place Africa on a path for sustained value-added productive capacity for decades to come. It is in this area of responsibility that the AfCFTA Secretariat, together with partners such as the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, have undertaken an exercise to make an assessment of regional value chains that could be established in support of AfCFTA implementation in order to accelerate Africa's industrialization. Some of the value chains that have been already discussed in detail include agriculture, agro-processing, pharmaceuticals, and the automobile sector. Furthermore, the negotiations of AfCFTA Phase 2, which include intellectual property rights, investment protection, digital trade, women in trade, all of these areas all of these are important areas, remaining areas of the negotiations, and where we are able to successfully conclude these negotiations, we have an opportunity to position Africa for industrial development, accelerated industrial development, and to position Africa for industrial revolution challenges, for the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution, particularly in the area of digital trade. Let me conclude by saying that without a clear and advanced and aggressive industrial development action plan, we will continue to lag behind, not only because of COVID-19, but because of legacy challenges that we had always experienced as a continent. Through the AfCFTA, we now have a very unique opportunity to accelerate the establishment of the value chains that I mentioned, to work together with the African Union, with UNECA, and other partners to ensure that we do indeed see benefits of these value chains that are so critical to Africa's industrialization. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this webinar today. Thank you.
There you go. This was the message from Wamkele Mene. He actually mentioned to me that he wanted to highlight also that UNCTAD has a very critical role in progressing the agenda of the Africans, and some of the partners in the continent will not be able to make it without the support of other institutions such as UNCTAD. I think it's important to listen to someone like Arkebe, my brother Arkebe, who is the next on our lineup, because of his experience in implementing industrial policy. As we know, some people will question the industrial policy as the way to go. Some will go further and say that you can have industrialization as part of just a diversification drive without too much emphasis on how you are going to do a structural transformation. I think it would be important to distill some of these nuances because they are very important in the relationship between trade and industry. And at the time where Africans are moving in the direction of accelerating their trade integration, it's very important to understand whether that is a good move in terms of opportunity and moment, and whether that is possible without a proper industrial policy drive. So I think no other than Arkebe will be qualified to give us some insights and some of his own personal experience in dealing with these issues. He has been widely published in this area, but he's also a senior minister and a policy practitioner. So with a quite large exposure, with Ethiopia being one of the models that people looked into in terms of, the way it has dealt with various specific aspects of the how. And having done that recently and having a lot of inspiration from Asia, it would be very interesting for Arkebe to give us his views. You have the floor, Arkebe.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Richard. I would like to thank UNCTAD and all its partners for organizing this series of discussions, and today a timely topic linked with AfCFTA and also COVID-19 crisis, in a way how it's connected with industrial policy and industrialization. I should also thank Danny Roderick joining us as it's early morning, I think in your place. And it's great to have you here because one of the inputs we have used in the introduction chapter of the Oxford Handbook of Industrial Policy has been the material prepared by Danny Roderick on industrial policy in the 21st century, which I believe is an important input for today's conversation. I see two important drivers that will shape or that may potentially shape the industrialization potential and industrial policy in our continent. One is the issue of that comes with the crisis or survival, I would consider, with COVID-19 pandemic as well as the economic recession. The second major element is the African Continental Free Trade Area. When we look at these two drivers, potentially one coming from a crisis, second one from an opportunity, which has been a part of the journey since, let's say, 1963, establishment of Organization for African Union, unity. Key elements I believe are important is the African Continental Free Trade Area has been looked at mostly from as a journey to economic integration. And I should mention that African Union and also United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has also done excellent job in this area. It was primarily targeted and focused on the economic unity or economic integration opportunity, including common market. However, what we have seen once African leaders decided to proceed or to launch the Continental Free Trade Area is that the agenda of industrialization has come to the forefront because free trade doesn't make sense when goods are not manufactured and we don't have goods that can be transacted, manufactured in the continent. So the biggest merit of the African Continental Free Trade Area, from my perspective, is that it has squarely put the agenda of industrialization in front of African leaders and policymakers. We can't avoid this agenda. We cannot say it's secondary because we need goods to be transacted. So this is a key driver, and it's important that the Secretariat have also tried to bring this to the forefront. So this brings us back to the challenges that we need to address from this perspective. One is, how do we move industrialization forward? And how do we link productive investment with creation of industrial ecosystem and development of domestic capability and linkages? The second important point, which is also linked with COVID-19 crisis, is how do we build the regional and sub-regional value chains? And the third element is we cannot isolate the issue of industrialization and the free trade area implementation without a targeted infrastructure development. If we don't have energy, we cannot talk much about industrialization. If we cannot have connectivity, it would be impossible to work on industrialization. However, these are demand huge resource, and we have to be targeted, and we have to be very, very selective on the type of infrastructure we may need to develop. In addition to this, this also brings us an opportunity. What type of industrialization should we develop? As we all know, climate change, environmental sustainability has become inseparable agenda of industrialization. So while we pursue this agenda, we need to link it with the carbon neutral industrialization and trying to avoid and learning from what other forerunners have been doing. Again, in this aspect, we cannot separate from the political process and political economy issues across our continent, because conflicts in some regions or borders would definitely impact also on this free trade area. So one key element that will drive the industrialization exercise and also demand implementation of industrial policy is the Continental Free Trade Area. However, we are in the middle of COVID-19 crisis, and every country in this continent, including those relatively advanced economies like South Africa, are coping with the crisis. It's one of the toughest challenges and crises. However, if we look on the brighter side, the biggest blessing, I would say, is that the COVID crisis has brought the agenda of industrial policy and industrialization to the forefront. I don't think the dialogue has fundamentally changed and there is a paradigm shift, but we have seen important lessons in this process. First, we have seen the crisis that developing countries have been significantly more affected than advanced economies. Double, I would say, the scale, the effect on advanced economies, requiring longer recovery process and vulnerability. Secondly, economies that are diversified have been able to cope better than those who have not diversified their economies, even those oil-rich countries like Nigeria. So economic diversification has clearly shown to be critical. And we have seen that countries that can produce vaccines can protect their population, and countries that cannot produce vaccines or PPE, or those who do not have even the research and development capacity, will be vulnerable. And this has implied that industrial capacity matters, and R&D and technology even becomes more critical. Not only manufacturing capacity is enough, but as we have seen in India, but also the capacity for research has to go parallel with creation of industrial policy, industrial capacity. We have also seen that unlike the advices given conventionally, that state and government coordination matters a lot. And we have seen this across the board. Governments in advanced economies or emerging economies or developing countries who have been able to cope with the crisis are those where there is more effective state apparatus, where there is better government coordination. And we have also seen that the policy environment is changing significantly. Resilience has become a critical hallmark. We have seen that adaptation and learning is a critical element now in industrial policy, because the conventional understanding of industrial policy was the long-term perspective, having a planned economy, while we know that from the disruption we have seen during COVID, that in uncertain times and turbulent times in interconnected world, we need adaptive industrial policy, and resilience becomes critical. While these two are key drivers, we need to link them with the debate conversation we have over decades. We have seen the 80s, 90s, the prescription and the Washington prescriptions were not working. We have seen after year 2000 that the agenda conversation has changed, shifting that poverty can be challenged only when there is growth. But in the last decade also, we saw that the agenda of economic transformation has become to the forefront. And this was part of the debate also stimulated by UNCTAD, by UNECA, Africa Union, and other international scholars. So I believe we are in the right path because economic transformation is central. And when we talk about transformative industrialization also, we need to bear in mind that we need to have active industrial policy, which is targeted, productive, and adaptive. We also need to look at how to secure. The challenge is not, the challenge for economic transformation is first, how do we ensure rapid growth? Without rapid growth, my belief is that it will be impossible to secure transformation. The second aspect is how do we combine economic diversification with job creation? We have seen jobs, millions of jobs lost, and for our continent, where demography demands millions of jobs, job creation becomes central in the industrialization agenda. And we have also seen that the macroeconomic aspect, the infrastructure development and human skills need to be looked at with the perspective on industrial policy. And again, sustainability needs to be part of this process.
Well, thank you very much, Arkebe, for a very clear message about the how and also the priorities as you see them in light of the pandemic impact. We are now going to turn to Danny. Danny has been an inspiration for all of us. We have all read his very important contributions in this field. Your book, Straight Talk on Trade, comes to mind, Danny, as one that announced a number of changes, emerging new trends in the global governance that are going to impact the way we deal with trade. The pandemic has accelerated a lot of the things that you have identified. And we have now come at the crossroads for African countries in particular, where at the very time that they are trying to put industrial policy at the center and trying to integrate with the Continental Free Trade Area, their commitment to an economy that is less carbon intensive is going to be met by all these new subsidies that are being implemented in different rich countries and that are going to basically create a carbon taxation system, a carbon market that may penalize their industrialization. This is just one aspect of the environment that we'll have to deal with, very difficult before the pandemic, even more difficult after the pandemic. And we are eager to listen to your input in this regard. I think when we look into the challenges that the Continental Free Trade Area in Africa will have to face, probably there are as many internal to Africa as to the economic global governance. So Danny, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carlos. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. I greatly enjoyed the comments of Arkebe just prior, as well as what Wamkele said. And we thank, in particular, UNCTAD in the person of Richard for organizing this. Many people may not know that UNCTAD gave me my very first job in development. And so I have, so my gratitude and closeness in spirit to UNCTAD is quite great. Of course, UNCTAD has been an institution which has always stood for somewhat unconventional, at least by the standards of the mainstream economics profession, somewhat unconventional ideas for economic policy, for the world economy, and for development. But my sense is that conventional wisdom has been moving progressively towards the UNCTAD position on a whole lot of dimensions, from macroeconomic policy to trade policy to what is our topic today, industrial policy. As I think Richard noted, industrial policy is now totally mainstream. The United States has announced explicitly an industrial policy. Of course, what's new about this is not that the United States is going to engage in industrial policy. It always has. What's new is that the United States administration, the Biden administration, now explicitly announces that as an industrial policy and lays out a coherent strategy forward, or an explicit strategy for what it's going to be, for what it's going to look like. So I think the question, therefore, is no longer should countries pursue industrial policy. Increasingly, it's a question of what does this industrial policy consist of? In other words, it's not if, it's how. How do we do the industrial policy? I think that's why this panel and the panel that will follow are so important. Now, when we think about industrial policy, often we have in our minds sort of the countries that have pursued industrial policy very successfully to industrialize, and those are the East Asian countries, with the examples of South Korea and Taiwan, and of course more recently China. And there is a particular type of industrial policy that's associated with these East Asian growth champions, which is not necessarily the right model of industrial policy for latecomers, for countries in low-income Africa or South Asia, or lower-income countries in Latin America. So I think, I guess my first point is that when we think about the how of industrial policy, we need to think differently from the traditional East Asian model. Now, what's the traditional East Asian model? To caricature somewhat, it's basically you have a powerful government, powerful bureaucracy that first selects a number of sectors for promotion, and the promotion in those could be, sort of, kind of sectors that countries somewhat richer than them succeeded in the recent past. So it's a number of sectors that might be promoted. And then secondly, it's a series of instruments for promoting them. So that might be export subsidies, or it might be industrial or credit subsidies. It might be other direct public investment through state enterprises. But then in that sort of classic vision of industrial policy consists of a set of sectoral priorities and a set of policy tools. And if you were asked, what's your industrial policy? The answer would be, here are my sectoral priorities, and here are my policy tools. Now, without question, that has been successful in some East Asian countries. There's a recent paper by, well, actually the paper has been around for a very long time, but by Nathan Lane, but it's sort of using all the sort of the most sophisticated quantitative empirical tools of the profession, shows how the heavy and industrial chemical promotion policies of Korea in the late 1970s essentially created dynamic comparative advantage and created all kinds of new industries and produced spillovers for the Korean economy. Now, none of this is going to be a surprise to anybody who's been looking at East Asia, but now these are sort of very much mainstream kinds of ideas. But this is not what has worked in other countries, and I think increasingly in today's world, that's not what works. I think the kinds of industrial policy principles that apply these days are much less top-down, much less relying on the idea that the government can pick certain sectors, relies much less on an ex-ante determined set of policy instruments, but relies instead on a much more sort of collaborative, bottom-up, interactive, iterative, learning over time which types of policy instruments ought to be deployed kind of approach. So this is it's a different institutional configuration for industrial policy, where instead of governments simply saying these are the sectors we should promote, and here are our promotion instruments. It's a set of institutional arrangements where, through a variety of arrangements, governments get together with producers, try to find out where the blockages are, and try to remove those blockages with the instruments that might be most directly available or suitable. So it's much more agnostic, exposed about what type of activities to promote. It's also very agnostic about what type of instruments are going to be required. Sometimes it might be relaxing zoning restrictions. Sometimes it might be changing a tax rate. Sometimes it might be about labor market institutions. But this process of consultation and iterative collaboration with different parts of the private sector, which is a process of learning about productive opportunities and learning about what to do, which is built into the process, is a different types of industrial policy. And in fact, if you look a bit closer to what countries like South Korea and Taiwan and China have done, you start to see that the details of the success are also in this kind of iterative process, that it looks like the government simply set the rules and then step back, but in fact it was really much more iterative, and that's the kind of point that scholars like Peter Evans have emphasized with this term of embedded industrial policy, that it's embedded in the workings of industry. So that's sort of one component of the new aspect, which is that let's not be too let's think about industrial policy in this new way. And in my paper on industrial policy for the 21st century, which I think AfCFTA mentioned earlier, that's the part that I was really focusing on. There's another aspect of sort of how we need to rethink industrial policy, which I did not, I believe, focus on that paper, which is the second major point I want to make, which is really about the objective of industrial policy. What should be the objective of industrial policy? Now, in East Asia, it was very clear. It was really exports. It was just to create exports, partly because, of course, exports were viewed as an indicator of productivity. So if you were able to export, you must have been productive. If you're productive, of course, that's how you get growth through increase in productivity. Today, I think if most practitioners of industrial policy, if you talk to them about what they're trying to achieve, it's about similar kinds of things of increasing productivity, increasing exports, increasing competitiveness, increasing physical investment. Increasingly about sort of talks about global value chains and insertion into global value chains. Now, all those things are important, but I want to say they're not as important as the creation of productive employment, good jobs. Now, I think this is a tension which was always sort of below the surface, traditional industrial policy, but was not as big a tension as it has become over time. Traditionally, when China did not need to worry that by promoting new industries, it would also be promoting millions of new jobs in manufacturing in the urban areas. And so the objectives of increasing exports, increasing industrial production, increasing physical investment in manufacturing, and increasing employment, better paying jobs in these more productive things, those were more or less went the same way. Today, I don't think that is true anymore, primarily because of the nature of technological change, that the kind of manufacturing that is going to enable you to plug into global value chains, the most productive sectors, the sectors that are most likely to increase exports, even in developing countries, are not going to create the kind of productive jobs, are not creating the kind of productive jobs that these economies need. And everybody on this panel has emphasized the importance of jobs. But the problem is, it doesn't work when you say, well, production, investment, and jobs, because they don't necessarily all come together. So you can emphasize global value chains, export productivity, and you'll get some champions, you'll get some firms that introduce themselves into global value chains, but you are not going to create the kinds of jobs that you create, even you want. Even in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which have been really successful in speeding up industrialization in recent decades through manufacturing, the bulk of the jobs have not been created in manufacturing in the most productive, in the export-oriented large firms. Instead, they've been created in small-scale, informal, low-paid wage employment or low-paid informal employment. So they are not the kinds of jobs. They're no different effectively from sort of petty services or the informal services that the whole point of structural transformation is to pull people out of. So what does that mean? It means that if you look at industrial policy from the perspective of the job of industrial policy is to create productive jobs. It's a very different take on what industrial policy or what kind of industrial policy you want to pursue. It makes hard or soft conditionality on employment creation essentially a critical component of industrial policy. If you're promoting sectors, if you're promoting firms, if you're talking to them, employment becomes number one. It doesn't have to be employment directly in those firms or sectors. It could be downstream, it could be upstream, it could be in service activities that they're related through input-output relationships and linkages and so forth. But that has to be really, it seems to be number one, especially in low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where creating more productive jobs is really essential, absolutely essential. So this is an area where I think industrial policy and social policy become largely similar, because the point of industrial policy becomes to create good jobs for a large number of urban job seekers. And at the same time, social policy increasingly starts to look like industrial policy, because if you start asking question, how do I train my young workers, how do I increase education, skills, and so forth? It becomes, how do I position them to take better, more productive jobs in manufacturing or services? So it creates a large degree of overlap between social policy and industrial policy. But I want to again end by emphasizing that that this does require a different mental frame from the one that we associate industrial policy with, which is this this focus on exports, on productivity, on physical investment, global value chains. That is fine, but I don't think none of them is as important as creating more productive jobs, and they're not one and the same with those objectives. And then the job of actually conducting industrial policy starts to look very different, I think, in a way that no country has really done. So we're really on uncharted waters here that I think will implies a kind of a reconceptualization and reorganization of the instruments and institutions of industrial policy as we go forward. So let me just stop here. Carlos, you're on mute.
Thank you. I wanted to thank Danny for this very interesting input into our discussion, this webinar, and invite those who have questions to basically send them to the chat or the Q&A, so we can capture the questions and eventually move forward. But since we don't have questions yet, I'm going to use the prerogative of being a moderator to ask a question of my own. Richard, after the various inputs that we got from both Arkebe, Danny, and Wamkele, I'm curious to know, what do you think is the room that the CFTA negotiators will have given the current environment in Geneva? And I'm saying this knowing that there are moves, particularly on the part of the European Union, to curtail some of this margin of maneuver by having agreements signed in fragmented parts of Africa that are not going to allow the CFTA to be the main interlocutor in the near future. I'm referring to the economic partnership agreements, I'm referring to the post-Cotonou agreement, so a number of bilateral agreements. So basically there is a fragmentation of the negotiating capacity that Africans could master if they had the CFTA as the main interlocutor. And given what has just happened in the pandemic, with vaccines, with protective equipment, we had a bit of an illustration of how we are seeing a gap between proclamations and actually implementation of solidarity and different ways of moving trade in a more equitable basis. Danny has just mentioned to us that we cannot do industrialization, industrial policy the same way as before. And even the experiences of Asia, are important for Africa to a point, but not necessarily the main vehicle for us to be able to implement a successful industrialization process, and that the odds are not in favor. And I just added this other odd, which is, you have a CFTA, but it comes at a time where we are seeing a fragmentation of Africa and difficulties for us to be able to have one voice in the international negotiations. Richard?
Thanks, Carlos. There's some great questions, so let me be quick. I think one of the things I take from what has been said already is that you can't have a you can't create a successful free trade area with free trade policies. I think that's a lesson I think we in UNCTAD have insisted on for a long time. And I guess we do, we worry obviously that the direction of the negotiations in the WTO look very much like business as usual, and not just in the WTO. If you read the communique, for example, of the G7 trade ministers that was presented, I think last month or the month before, in the context of the G7 discussions in the UK. Now, it's a very standard type of recommendations that are on the table. More liberalization. If we can't do multilateral, we'll do plurilateral. Subsidies are bad, and accept the subsidies that we use, because the subsidies that we use are good subsidies, but the subsidies that the developing countries want to use are always bad subsidies. State-owned enterprises are always bad. Some of this, of course, is an attack on China, but the larger narrative, I think, is in terms of that is very different from, Danny was right. There's a very different narrative going on in Washington around industrial policy, but it doesn't seem to be translated into the discussions around trade, WTO reform, etc. And I think that's a worry in general, but it's got to be a worry for the designers and implementers of the free trade area, because there's potential for very serious inconsistency and ultimately conflict, I think, between that agenda that seems in which the advanced economies are still wedded to, and the kind of agenda that you were talking about, Carlos, in your presentation, and everyone else has been discussing. So there is a serious, I think, issue about a continued clash of ideas that could be very disruptive in terms of advancing the kinds of agenda beyond the free trade agenda to get a functional free trade area.
Yeah, thank you. Danny, there is a question for you here. Given that industrialization eventually increases capital share in production as opposed to labor, how will we be able to increase employment?
Well, there's nothing wrong with the capital output ratio rising over the course of development. This is, one of the things that happens as countries get rich. They accumulate capital. There's a process of capital deepening, and that's a process whereby capital deepening also means that labor is more productive. That's how, in part, you get more productivity, by having more capital to work with. Now, I think so that on its own is not the problem. That's how South Korea developed, that's how Taiwan developed, that's how China developed, that's how all today's developed countries developed. The problem, and what we're experiencing today in the low income and also middle income countries to some extent is bifurcation, is dualism, is that you have capital deepening and relatively capital and skill intensive technologies being adopted by a very small and narrow range of firms that can successfully compete on world markets or are part of global value chains. So they become like a kind of an enclave part of the economy. We talk about enclaves in developing countries, we usually have in mind like resource sectors, which are very capital intensive, generate a lot of rents and wealth for a relatively small number of people. But in some ways, given what has been happening, a combination of technological change and the inability of developing countries to adjust appropriately, is that sort of these export-oriented industrialized sectors, manufacturing sectors, are increasingly looking like these enclave sectors that are very productive. They could have been anywhere in the world, and they're part of global value chains, but they're a tiny, tiny part of the economy. They're absorbing a very small, even tinier share of total employment. And all of employment is essentially in the rest of the informal sector, traditional agriculture, or informal activities in services in the urban sectors. So it's that that dualism, inability to create appropriate jobs for the kind of workers that exist, not the most skilled ones. That is the primary failing of developing countries. So, development is a kind of a process, and if you suddenly put in just the most advanced industries into a few manufacturing sectors are not generating enough employment there, you're just going to get this kind of a dualistic structure. So it goes back to our discussion back in the 70s of the inappropriate technologies, which then at the time actually probably didn't make sense with hindsight, but now I think is increasingly probably a real issue.
Thank you. There is a question for you, Arkebe. When we have the situation of some least developed countries with very difficult deficits in infrastructure, problems relating to capacity, how can they implement industrial policy? Or is there a difference between different countries in Africa in terms of capacity for implementation of industrial policy?
Thank you, Carlos. I think the first point we need to underline is all African countries are not going to follow a common, let's say, policy direction. The local context differs significantly, not only resource base, but also the political structure. So each country has to find its own path. And this is very, very important because we cannot just have a common development path for all African countries. So the first point is recognizing that each country has to look at its peculiarities. But secondly, experience sharing can have significant influence. We have seen it in East Asia. Experiences from Japan has been inspiring to many East Asian countries. And within our continent also, the policy dialogue, experience sharing will have significant implication to understand what happens, what has worked or what has not worked, or even lessons from practical experience. The other critical issue is that, each government has to learn through practicing. It's easier at abstract level to discuss these issues about having, common policies or, putting directions, but ultimately it will depend on the capacity of the government, and there is no shortcut that a government can just become the next week or the next month to be effective. It has to implement, it has to learn from practical experience, and also a need for some common political platform. One of the things we look at it is from the governance side. We know that many African countries follow multi-party system, and it's part of the existing reality. And one of the problems is these shifts also imply that not coherent policy is implemented for a long period, which we have seen in many countries where there is some political consensus. So one critical element and drawback we need to understand and to see opportunities how the political elite could work together is identifying common platform whereby there could be some level of continuity in terms of policies, because the policies we are discussing require a long-term implementation and outcome. If we talk about growth, the growth we have seen in East Asia has gone for a longer episode, like 3 decades, average of 7% or something like that. And in Africa, one of the problems is we have short episodes and combined with crisis. And if we need to change this process, there must be some political consensus on policies to be adapted or policies to be continued despite changes in the political system.
One follow-up question for you, Arkebe. In reaction to COVID, some of the talk about industrial policy in Africa and the CFTA has centered around resilience and even sovereignty, with the need to expand manufacturing capacity for production of essential goods, very much on the agenda, and pharma in particular. How does this match up with the need to develop job-intensive sectors, rather, that may no longer be in the manufacturing, as Danny has said?
If we look at the COVID-19 crisis and especially the required products like PPE or vaccines, I don't see these have been the areas where there is huge opportunity of for job creation. In a way also there is, if we look at PPE, at some point the demand came, including diagnostic, COVID-19 diagnostic, PCR production, but where vaccines came, the PCR tests, gradually the demand decreased, and such production is not implemented or executed by many firms. They are limited firms. The PP is a lower end product. Yes, of course, apparel companies can shift to that and can continue to employ their workers. So for me, I agree the importance of productive jobs, which Danny emphasized, and earlier I mentioned that we have to combine economic diversification with job creation. And if we look at productive jobs, one of the critical challenges, for instance, in informal sectors is the nature of these productive or decent jobs, because the jobs are lost in a very short period. The potential for skill upgrading and reskilling, it becomes limited. The attrition of firms also is quite high. So in net, the accumulation of skills and capacity is constrained by this process. So we need to combine this with the economic diversification. Also, the conventional type of the industrial policy in Asia targeting sectors may not be the only blueprint, but ultimately we have to choose where are productive jobs to be created. And not only identifying these potential areas or activities, but also how are these productive activities to shift through time? Because now every industry is going through a process. COVID-19 has shown us the importance of resilience in the value chain, supply chain, in the productive process. We have seen technology also making significant changes even in many labor-intensive industries. So there is a constant need for understanding how the productive activities are also shifting. And when we look also at productive jobs, we need to look at the education component that is relevant for skills upgrading. For instance, science technology will continue to be very important. But if the university education system has not been transformed to reflect this, then the issue of productive jobs will be constrained. So we need to look at how to transform our university education system, how the technical and vocational education system is going to be transformed. We also need to see how firms' policies that will encourage firms to invest in skill upgrading, because without that incentive, they will not be able to spend money. They need to see that they will be reaping the benefits, because if they lose jobs that were well trained to other firms, then they will be net losers. So important instruments are required, how to encourage firms to upgrade their skills. And also in a broader terms, some jobs are going to be replaced by new jobs. So the importance of reskilling has to be part of the education system, and labor productivity also becomes critical when we talk about jobs, productive jobs. So I think the economic diversification, from my perspective, is an inseparable component from creation of productive jobs.
Well, thank you. Daniel, one last question for you. It's a bit grouping of different questions that we got here in the chat. Is it possible to envisage more coordination of industrial policy with the CFTA amongst African countries, or is it going to be a race to the bottom? What type of coordination would be envisageable, for instance, on establishment of regional value chains, or having some prioritization at the regional level?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see at all that there has to be a race to the bottom, and I think there are areas for cooperation and regional integration. I mean, to some extent, a kind of a regional integration and regional deepening of certain value chains would be a kind of a normal process that might need only a little bit of nudge, a little bit of assistance from governments to remove artificial obstacles. And so, you know, just like import substitution is a natural part of development, regional integration is a natural part of countries increasing trade and growing. And I think sort of the African free trade area might provide a kind of an opportunity where you know, there's these you know, transnational discussions about these opportunities that might not have occurred otherwise. I think just trying to create these opportunities through, you know, external barriers is probably not very productive at this stage. But there are certainly, both in terms of regional infrastructure projects that might promote further a deepening of industrialization, or specifically focusing on the regional value chains. Those are all you know, opportunities that currently do exist for Africa, given, you know, that Africa is starting from so far behind. But again, I mean, you know, I come back to the same question now. You know, as policymakers prioritize what they're going to do, I think it's very important to have the objective very explicit. it does, in terms of project selection, in terms of where you put your priorities and your political capital, it makes a big difference if you're emphasizing your number 1, 2, and 3 goal is to increase productive employment. And the question you're asking is, what is the likely impact on productive job, direct and indirect, of some project that I'm going after, which I'm trying to sort of remove obstacles on, as opposed to, will this, how much exports will it generate, or how much physical investment will it generate, or will these be the most productive activities? Because that, again, may not be what development requires if the most productive activities end up employing a very, very tiny share of your labor force. So I think, the objective matters a lot, and I'm not quite sure that either in national industrial policies or in transnational or international or regional collaboration, that the degree of emphasis that productive job creation ought to have independently as an objective on its own, or as the overarching objective of its own, I think has occupies the place it ought to.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, the panel, for excellent contributions to this webinar. I'm now going to move into the second panel, which is very much a follow-up of the same discussion from a perspective of being a bit more grounded on issues that are of concern from the post-COVID. And no better than Jomo Kwame Sundaram to start with this panel, giving us a bit of a perspective from Asia. He knows Africa so well. We in Africa tend to consider him African, not only because of his name, but also because of his knowledge of the continent. So it is really a pleasure for me to welcome Jomo, who is a renowned scholar, and also someone that has occupied very important functions in the UN system and elsewhere, to give us the perspective. And he has been listening to the first panel, so it's a good segue into the discussion. Jomo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you for this kind invitation to join you today. I think it might be useful for us to revisit the arguments usually made about trade in terms of trade liberalization, including the regional FTAs. I think it's quite well known that after World War II, for example, the US was actually quite resistant to trade liberalization, despite having a significant industrial and technological advantage coming out of the Second World War. And this has to do with for a number of reasons. And as a result, although the Bretton Woods system, the Bretton Woods arrangements had been made in 1944, there was no subsequent international trade organization created. Paul Samuelson had pointed out around writing in the 1940s that trade liberalization is not one which basically lifts all boats, but there are winners and losers. And the only way to ensure that trade liberalization is acceptable is to ensure that the winners compensate the losers. This is difficult enough at the national level in the case of the US, but it's even more difficult internationally, and very few viable arrangements have been made. And this is part of the reason why there is actually a lot of resistance to trade liberalization. Now, thinking about notions of so-called static versus dynamic comparative advantage, Justin Lin has talked about this, and various other people have talked about it. It really is something which we intuitively feel about, but there is no significant, serious theory of dynamic comparative advantage, because the whole exercise and the demonstration of ostensible welfare gains is really one based on comparative statics. And this, I think, is important to recognize, and also they largely ignore various types of externalities, which are so important in understanding the concrete policy problems in the real world. Moving on very quickly, I think as Jagdish Bhagwati, who is a great proponent of trade liberalization, always emphasized that regional free trade agreements are like termites in the system, as to use his term. And it's very interesting that the last chief economist of the World Bank, suggested that the African Continental Free Trade Area would be an exception. But she never, although she's a trade economist, she never offered any reasoning for this. So the understanding of these kinds of issues is really all over the place. And when you look at so-called free trade agreements in recent times, they really have very, very little to do with trade liberalization, but actually have much more to do with all kinds of non-trade issues, as we have been reminded, for example, in the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership proposal of former President Barack Obama. Now, moving very quickly to trying to understand the significance of trade liberalization, I think as Richard hinted earlier, trade liberalization was not a part of the East Asian miracle story. Certainly not at the national level, particularly for Northeast Asia. And so how do we understand then what has happened? If we look at the World Bank's version of East Asian miracle, what they tell us is that there is a different, what we find in East Asia is a compulsion towards export-oriented industrialization. I would basically suggest that if you look at what happened in East Asia, you actually have a very different kind of story, which is of effective protection conditional on export promotion. And this, I think, is very, very different from a simple export-oriented promotion story. Now, looking at the recently, of course, we know that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership proposal has been approved for the region. But before that, the only arrangement was the ASEAN Free Trade Area, which was approved in the 1990s. And even that was greatly resisted, but for a whole variety of reasons. And this is, I think, important for us to understand when we are trying to think about what is likely to happen with an African Continental Free Trade Area. When we think about, there was the obvious understandable resistance from less developed countries to Singapore's presence, for example, because Singapore obviously had far more advanced technological capacities and capabilities. Malaysia and Thailand would probably have come next. But they were often in rivalrous positions, as I will mention later. And of course, the other members of the ASEAN Free Trade Area also had concerns of their own, that whatever few capacities they had would become a problem. So in anticipating what is likely to happen, for example, in Africa, there will be a great deal of apprehension, for example, about South Africa or even Morocco's relatively more developed industrial and technological capacities and capabilities compared with the rest of the region. Now, we think about what has happened with the automotive industry. Malaysia, which had gotten off to a promising start in the 1980s, basically has floundered, whereas Thailand has actually emerged as the sort of Detroit of the East. It's a longer story, which I don't have time to get into, but I would particularly warn against Africa prioritizing the automotive trade as a whole, precisely because of its complexities, and it really would represent another round of import substitution. But in a sense, we should not avoid regional cooperative arrangements because of the resemblance to import substitution. Because one of the problems of import substitution in the past is the very fact that you have a very limited domestic market, and you're not able to move sufficiently and graduate from that limited domestic market. Moving on, I think it is useful for us to think back about something which Danny Roderick reminded us of some time ago, and it was his important insight that actually what we call industrial policy today is actually about investment and technology promotion. So if we think about investment and technology promotion, the emphasis really shifts away from trade liberalization as instrument. So how do we promote certain types of investments, certain types of technologies in the African context? And this becomes important. And one important element, of course, is the whole question of ownership. If you look back at the Northeast Asia, especially, until the 1990s, there was very little, relatively little FDI. It was, big emphasis was on developing domestic capacities and capabilities. So ownership is important. It's not a question which is where you leave things to the market. Now, in the case of China, they did things slightly differently, but I think it's very important to recognize that today, part of the resilience of the most technologically advanced Chinese industries are precisely because they are domestically owned. And some of the most problematic areas are those where, for example, some of their companies are listed. For example, if you think about Sinopharm, one of the companies which has developed a vaccine. Now, another issue, of course, is the selective versus the general promotion of industrialization, which has already been hinted at, and I won't get into all that. But if over a quarter century ago, in the 1990s, I was Richard's predecessor, Yilmaz Akgüz, invited me to join a project in UNCTAD where we looked at some of these issues. And I just want to sort of highlight a few things from that. Of all the industries, of all the activities which I looked at in that context, the only one which was really from a natural resource was actually timber processing. Almost everything else was not a natural or autochthonous resource. So if you think about Thailand's very successful development of gemstone processing, or Malaysia's development of rubber, palm oil, as well as cocoa, all these three crops were all imported from Brazil, from West Africa, in the case of oil palm, as well as cocoa. Or if you think about Thailand's success in becoming the single largest exporter of the most popular fish among Bengalis, hilsa, that was basically an imported fish, and it's bred very successfully in the case in Thailand. And now Thailand is the single largest exporter of that. There's a very interesting story which I'm tempted to tell, but I'm running out of time, so let me not get into about the story of how the Mississippi Delta catfish became the dory in the case of Vietnam. But moving on very quickly, I think it's important to recognize that 2021 is also the year of the Fourth Ldc Summit. I'm not sure what has happened to it, but this is one area which UNCTAD has had some responsibility for. And this, of course, is linked to the whole question of the fact that many African countries are among the poorer LDCs and therefore have certain privileges which have been hard fought and need to be defended. This is extremely important. If you think about Bangladesh and how they have been able to use more than the TRIPS public health exception, which Nelson Mandela fought for in the late 1990s. In fact, some of those options are now, with Bangladesh graduating very soon, those are options which are going to be available to some of the more technologically more sophisticated countries like Ethiopia, countries like Malawi, countries like Zimbabwe, where you have a highly educated upper echelon of people, some of whom are in the diaspora now for various political and military reasons, but who are willing to come back, as we saw in the case of Malawi. Another area which we really need to think about, of course, is climate finance. I mean, it's almost the only area where there's any hope of developing countries getting any money from abroad. And particularly, there has been a great deal of reluctance to provide significant funding for adaptation. And so that means that basically mitigation becomes important. And this was the inspiration in 2008, when Richard was working with us at the UN in New York, where we were proposing the Global Green New Deal. And it's still relevant in my view, but particularly it needs to be updated. Particularly there's tremendous potential for renewable energy and related development of, say, palm oil-based biodiesel. Palm oil is the cheapest vegetable oil by far, it's autochthonous to West Africa. And in fact, before the war, it was West Africa, particularly, and up to the Congo, which was the single largest producer of palm oil. And as far as photovoltaic solar panels, it involves less than 200 components. And although the price of photovoltaic solar panels have recently risen because of the higher cost of raw materials, it remains very, very competitive. And this is another area where many African countries are in the tropical belt. There's no problem of the supply of sunlight and so on and so forth. So this is one area, another area which has tremendous potential. Now, moving on very quickly, I think it is important to try to see how various areas which are considered to be social areas actually offer potential for industrial policy. And I would draw your attention to, for example, China has lifted more than 500 million people out of poverty. And part of this is due to very targeted programs in the most neglected and rural areas, which we should not ignore and forget about. And you have so-called school feeding programs. How do we augment the nutritional value of vegetables and so on and so forth. And in this respect, for example, there's a lot of research which is going on, unfortunately, less so nowadays compared to the end of the last century on developing agricultural products and so on and so forth, to which there can be food processing industries, which have become very, very important, especially as supply chains have been threatened, as AKB has reminded us. So, for example, in Malawi, there's the orange-colored sweet potato, which without doing any genetic engineering, you basically have a sweet potato which actually improves eyesight of children and adults as well. So there are a whole number of areas which I think allow us to think outside of the box, and ultimately, at the end of the day, whether or not these policies are successful depends a great deal on our pragmatism in addressing them. Let me stop here, Carlos. I'm sorry I ran over time. Thank you.
No, thank you. I didn't interrupt you because it was very interesting, and you gave us an helicopter view and then some stoppers that we need to bear in mind, like, for instance, the limitations of import substitution model, and but also some of its opportunities and how we should navigate those difficulties, and also how we can learn from experiences, including the ones that are closely related to developments in Africa that you have mentioned in the later part of your intervention. We have now 3 colleagues from South Africa that are going to give us perspectives that are Africa-centered, starting with Fiona. Fiona is the South Africa Research Chair for Industrial Development, and has done a lot of work on industrialization in Africa. She will be able to give us not only an academic perspective, but also she has been quite influential in policy settings. In terms of how we can ground this discussion, Fiona, help me with that in some of the challenges that we are facing immediately in the continent. Like, for instance, if you are going to introduce transformative industrialization, how we can mobilize the leadership to actually prioritize a certain number of decisions that are impeding us from moving, because there is a lot, again, of talk, but no action. But we still can count on a number of examples that have been quite prominent in the continent of late, of successful industrialization hubs, and Fiona will tell us more about it. You have the floor.
Thanks, Carlos. I'm really happy to be part of this great discussion and to share some thoughts on my views on transformative industrialization for Africa, which I'll be referring to as TIFA. So very briefly, I'm sure it's not necessary really for this audience, why the need for transformative industrialization for Africa. We know that Africa is the least industrialized region of the world. And there's really been a failure to industrialize in Africa over a long period of time. And although there's heterogeneity in the continent and different trends at present, we've seen stop-start industrialization and in some countries what I've referred to as pre-industrial deindustrialization. And in my view, it's brought a range of consequences beyond the effects on income per capita and the falling behind of growth and livelihoods in Africa compared to other developing regions of the world. More broadly, even beyond manufacturing, it's brought a lack of diversification, of complexity, of technological intensity, and obviously a range of economic factors that we could talk to in more detail. But I also wanted to draw attention to what I think are political and political economy consequences of this failure to industrialize, including the absence in most African countries of a mass industrial working class, and as a corollary, an independent or entrepreneurial national capitalist class. And I think this has brought a range of consequences for African countries, including around identity and ethnic identities, conflict, and so on, which perhaps is a broader discussion. And I think also a consequence of this failure to deeply industrialize is the difficulty which it brings of transitioning into growth pulling sectors on growth pulling services on any significant scale. So I want to underscore that I think industrialization is about much more than economic growth. Obviously, it is about balance of payments. It's about growth, but it's about more than that. And here I'm drawing on the experiences of the various industrial revolutions from the first to the fourth, which go beyond the technological and the economic factors. And I'm also thinking back to the wide-ranging analysis of Marx and other classical economists of the first industrial revolution, of classical structuralist economic thinking, particularly Prebisch, but also other sort of classic structuralists, which saw structural change and industrialization as economic, but also as more than that and as potentially more transformative than that. So in terms of transformative industrialization for Africa, what is this? What are some of the characteristics? And in my view, one of this is that it's systemic, and it links to what I've just been saying. It goes beyond growth, it goes beyond the economic to feed into grand societal challenges. I also see TIFA as disruptive of political economies, patterns of comparative advantage, production systems, social relations, and so on in African countries, insofar as these are suboptimal for growth and development. Catalytic in the sense that industrialization has to be about more than increasing value added and increasing employment within manufacturing. It's got to be catalytic across other sectors of the economy as well as more broadly. And the impact of truly transformative industrialization also needs to be long lasting. So we're not talking about stop-start industrialization. And when we look at, for example, the effects of countries that have deeply industrialized, even when they deindustrialize, those effects are enduring economically and socially. So this is some of the thinking which I would associate with transformative industrialization for Africa. So it's, I think, a bit of a broader concept than structural change and structural transformation, although that is part of it in the shift to higher productivity sectors. But I think it's a bit of a broader concept. And it's crucial in this, obviously, to take account of the diversity and the specific conditions of African countries, when designing what transformative industrial policy would mean in a particular country context, and also to take account of the changing boundaries of sectors, the blurring of boundaries, the changing nature of sectors, heterogeneity across sectors, and the fact that some subsectors are more growth pulling than others in different sectors, and so on. I think all of this is crucial in designing industrial policies for particular countries. So I would see a TIFA agenda as being part of new growth and development pathways for African countries. So to bring this abstraction slightly more specific, what are some of the characteristics of industrialization that I think can potentially make it transformative in African countries? I think that scale obviously matters in terms of the proportion of manufacturing in an economy. So while it's about much more than scale, if manufacturing is only a very small share of value added and particularly relevantly of employment, it obviously can't be transformative for the economy as a whole. It's also important that while there is heterogeneity within manufacturing, that on balance, manufacturing needs to be higher productivity, more complex, more technologically advanced, more innovative than the rest of the economy, or as I said, taking account of heterogeneity within each of the sectors. Jomo has also mentioned dynamic comparative advantage in a different way. I think for industrialization to be transformative, we've got to build in a notion of it being based on a dynamic comparative advantage or being a comparative advantage defying. A static notion of comparative advantage is definitely not going to open the way for transformative industrialization. And obviously, for industrialization to be transformative of the economy as a whole, a range of linkages and channels between manufacturing and the rest of the economy are crucial. So going beyond the classic kind of Hirschmanian forward and backward linkages to include also technological linkages between manufacturing and the rest of the economy, spillovers in learning, knowledge, skills, and so on. So I think some of the channels through which industrialization can be transformative is catalyzing upgrading in other sectors and contributing to building economy-wide productive capabilities. Then in terms of the more social and political economy aspects, here we are thinking about the transformative role of industrialization in terms of class formation, in terms of urbanization, modernization, drawing women into decent paid employment and so on. And contributing not only to economic growth, but more broadly to the societal grand challenges, which will differ by country, but poverty will be across the board, as well as we can think in the current context, the role of industrialization in meeting the challenges associated with the pandemic, the green transition, and so on. So moving quite quickly, I wanted just to, with one illustration, to bring this sort of broad conceptual thinking around a TIFA agenda and to illustrate it with reference to the instance of industrial hubs. Here I'm including industrial parks, zones, districts, and so on, as a way of contrasting what I would see as a TIFA agenda with a bit of a narrower industrialization agenda. So in a bit of a narrow or more traditional agenda, often the firms which are located in industrial hubs, there's not necessarily an emphasis on them being comparative advantage defying. They would be, in some cases, producing more of the same. So similar to what's already in a country's existing manufacturing profile, but producing more of that. And obviously there's nothing wrong with generating more jobs, more foreign exchange and so on. But from a TIFA agenda, I think that goes along with an emphasis on diversification and upgrading from a country's existing production profile. I think another kind of way of contrasting it is that in a non-transformative agenda, hubs can sometimes operate as enclaves in a more kind of maquila sort of model. So there's less emphasis on integration with the domestic economy through various linkages with supply chains, technological spillovers, and so on. I think also, what is the attraction for firms to locate in hubs? And this relates obviously to the policy towards this. In a sort of a non-transformative or a narrow approach, this is often based on wages and working conditions that are worse than in the rest of a domestic economy. Whereas from a more kind of dynamic, transformative agenda, I think some of the key attraction to firms locating in there is based more on the benefits of clustering and agglomeration, on export opportunities, and on positive incentives and support rather than exemptions. So I guess from a sort of a TIFA perspective, would consider the potential of industrial hubs, particularly in low-income African countries with really nascent manufacturing sectors, to support upgrading, to raise the scope for cumulative productivity increases, contribute to productive capabilities, and so on. And crucially, also outside of hubs and outside of manufacturing as part of that sort of TIFA agenda. So just very briefly, by way of concluding remarks, I think it would be remiss not to reflect briefly on the feasibility of a TIFA agenda, given that many African countries are struggling just with the basics of industrialization and industrial policy. It is an ambitious and aspirational vision and faces a range of challenges, including low skills, weak productive capabilities, making upgrading or leapfrogging very difficult. And that at least some of the manufacturing FDI in African countries is actually coming on the basis of relatively low wages and low unit labor costs. So is a TIFA vision a kind of Rolls Royce when we actually just need a bicycle? And I would respond to that in three brief ways. Firstly, that we need to recognize that pretty much any industrialization is better than none in a low-income country context. So especially where the manufacturing sector is only nascent, any industrialization can itself be transformative. It doesn't need to meet some kind of high bar of meeting the range of conditions and characteristics that I was suggesting as some sort of ideal set of characteristics. So even growth in kind of low wage, low skill, low productivity manufacturing is a start. But I think taking a kind of TIFA lens to even that sort of manufacturing can see it as part of a stepping stone to something broader. And lastly, that comparative advantage defying is of course country specific. So it would mean something very different for a middle income industrialized African country compared to a low income African country with very little manufacturing capabilities. So in the latter kind of country, comparative advantage defying obviously doesn't mean jumping to nanotechnology, but it means pushing the boundaries rather than just doing more of the same. Let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to alert everybody that we are running out of time. And the advantage that I have is that I can push the last two speakers slightly because they are my colleagues at the Nelson Mandela School. So I'm going to ask them to help me by being extremely brief in their presentations and actually ask Nimrod in particular to focus on one dimension of what I know you wanted to cover. Nimrod has quite a large experience being a senior specialist in the Department of Trade and Industry and Competitiveness of South Africa, has occupied a number of very important functions there, but is also now a part of the adjunct faculty of the Nelson Mandela School, to focus on the regional gains that we can have with the CFTA in terms of introducing value chains at the regional level or enhancing the existing ones. And ask Kirti, that I'm going to introduce later, to focus on the pharma, developments that we are seeing in the continent, manufacturing of vaccines being very prominent these days, and all the initiatives that are being taken around the possibilities pharmaceutical industry to take root in Africa and be enhanced. So those are two dimensions that I think are very much talking to the post-COVID world and how Africa can position itself to take advantage of the CFTA. So Nimrod, you have the floor.
Thanks, Carlos. I think I might have to just tear up my notes, and so, yeah, I mean, I think what the question that you're posing is, is actually quite a complex one. I think particularly in the light of some of the caveats that, for instance, Jomo has put on the table around what can and what one should expect or not from regional trade agreements. I think that we all know that there's some quite dramatic projections for the impact of implementation of the AfCFTA on things like not just the growth of trade, but growth of income and lifting people out of poverty on the continent. And I think it's really important for us to focus and be clear what are the mechanisms and preconditions for it to have that kind of transformative kind of impact along the lines that I think Fiona has begun to talk about. So I think one of the big issues that the continent faces is really how much will come from the trade liberalization or the trade promotion aspects of the AfCFTA, and how much of it is really about the production side, which I think is pretty much what Akebe was saying earlier. Investment in infrastructure, investment in productive capabilities, which necessarily requires large-scale financing and industrial policy. So one of the problems, one of the challenges that the continent faces in this integration task is the fact that there is this often very low levels of or kind of a mismatch between what is produced by various countries and what they demand. And so a lot of the limitations to trade are really around producing more of what either other African countries demand or the rest of the world demands, as well as for domestic demand. I think this is what we really need to place at the center of the regional integration and the way in which we take the AfCFTA forward. In terms of the opportunities, again, I think it's very important to make the distinction between what are the opportunities for far greater production for the continent itself. So these regional value chains, Carlos, that you've referred to, and what are the opportunities? Where are the opportunities relatively greater in producing outside of the continent for the rest of the world? And I think that there are opportunities for both. So I think that in terms of going to, I think, specific sectors and value chains, your own work and others, including the book that Akebe co-authored with Chris Kramer and John Sender, provide a very strong emphasis on the need for agricultural productivity, upgrading, narrowing the agricultural productivity gap. And this, I think, would have very transformative consequences in the broader sense in which Fiona has intimated, in terms of things like ranging from creating more jobs, potentially better jobs in agriculture, upgrading rural communities, cheaper sources of food. All of these things, I think, can be part of an agricultural upgrading agenda. Then, of course, there is tremendous opportunity for processing of agricultural products, both on the continent and beyond. I think another dimension is what's this argument around the so-called industrialization of freshness, where parts of agriculture itself are becoming, almost indistinguishable from what we have historically understood to be industrialization and manufacturing, and that's particularly in horticulture. I think Jomo has raised a very fascinating possibility around the use of palm oil for biofuels, particularly in ecological areas of the continent that are suitable for the expansion of production of palm oil. Turning to the links with climate change, greening of the economy, I think energy is an obvious area where where the continent can take advantage of the very large decreases in costs of renewable energy, photovoltaics, winds, and so forth, and draw on its very large scale solar and wind resources. There are areas of light manufacturing, particularly clothing and textiles. I think we've seen Ethiopia in particular begin to take advantage of those. Mining is an area that presents both tremendous challenges, coal production of being the obvious one, but Africa is also very well endowed with what might be called climate smart minerals. These certainly can provide directly and indirectly numerous opportunities. I think that one of the areas, the challenges that we're going to face is in heavy industry. On the one hand, I think that there actually are some advantages to production for the region in industries like chemicals, like steel, like cement. One of the major challenges here is going to be, will the continent be able to attract, the cleanest, most energy-saving technologies in this kind of production, or will it, in a sense, be lumped with, kind of second gen, kind of older technology? So I think all of these things present challenges, but I think enormous opportunities, tangible opportunities that I think we can begin to unpack. Lastly, of course, all of this is going to require financing at a very large scale. I think this raises the issues around that have been brought up around this notion of a Green New Deal. To what extent can there be kind of concessional international financing mobilized to make this transformation? To what extent could the continent rely on domestic sources of finance, mobilize domestic sources of finance? I think these are all going to be tremendous concerns that need to be addressed. I could say many more things, but I think in the interest of time, let me leave it there and thank everybody. I've enjoyed really, I think, a wide-ranging discussion in which I've certainly learned a lot. So thanks to everybody else on the panel, and thanks to all the participants.
Thanks, Nimrod, and apologies for putting you on the spot, but you succeeded in delivering exactly the points that I was looking for, that I think were missing in part of the discussion that we had so far. So now it's my pleasure to turn to Kirti. She's the Senior Research Fellow with the Mandela School, but she's someone quite experienced in the area that I asked her to verse on, having been for more than 20 years a very important player in all issues relating to health, pharmaceutical, developments here in South Africa, but also someone that has done a lot of work trying to understand how we can enhance manufacturing of pharmaceuticals and vaccines in particular of late because of the pandemic impact and all the discussions that ensued. Kirti, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carlos, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I was going to share some slides, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to. So in the context of industrial policy in the pharmaceutical sector, I think one of the things that we need to think about is how do we balance healthcare and public health with industrial policy? And it's a very important question to ask, because those are not necessarily objectives that are always aligned when it comes to policy making. And in Africa, we've seen that policymakers have prioritized the pharmaceutical sector for industrial development, with a clear focus on local manufacturing as a means to solve many problems with one target in terms of local manufacturing. That is to increase GDP growth through creating jobs, promoting local manufacturing, and then at the same time address public health issues, especially in the area of infectious diseases, because we all know that we've had the scourge of HIV, TB, malaria, and so on. Until now, we've seen that these plans have been implemented mostly at a national level in various countries, and I wanted to share some examples. So in South Africa, we've seen that the government has provided manufacturing incentives to local manufacturers. And this has the benefit that it provides manufacturers with much needed capital. We know that pharmaceutical manufacturing is very capital intensive, but on the downside, it's a massive cost for the government, and it's also risk-based based on the level of confidence that they have in the particular manufacturer. In countries like Tanzania and Nigeria, they've had negative import lists for certain medicines. This has the benefit that local manufacturers are protected from international competitors, but it also then prevents foreign investment. But also on the public health side, you then create potential impacts in terms of security of supply. In 2019, then we also saw Nigeria implementing a 5x5 plan. What that means is that importers then have to make commitments to local manufacturing within a certain time frame. So they either have to locally manufacture themselves, or they have to partner with local manufacturers. They either do that, or their medicines get cancelled in terms of being, in terms of the market authorization. So that has industrial policy impacts, but it also has public health consequences in terms of whether patients have access to those medicines. So a couple of years ago, I published a paper asking pharmaceutical companies what investment decisions do they make, knowing that these types of policies get implemented at a market level all over Africa. And essentially, the feedback was mostly that they will just not seek market authorization for certain medicines. So that has a negative investment impact. But again, one of the things that we don't think about is what are the public health consequences of that? Because we do know that there's a direct relationship between economic development and the state of healthcare in a country. And I think we have a live example right now with the pandemic on what negative impacts that can have. So even though we've had these national approaches to industrial policy and local manufacturing in various countries across the continent, we also have an overarching policy at a continent level for the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa. We still are predominantly dependent on imports, and particularly because of API imports. and China and India dominate that market. So about 60% of APIs are manufactured in China and India. And some of the previous speakers talked about climate change and the importance of thinking about climate change in the context of industrialization. And that's a very important point in the context of API manufacturing. And one of the criticisms of India and China with regards to API manufacturing is that they do not necessarily adhere to high environmental standards when it comes to API manufacturing. And this is one of the reasons why they can manufacture at such low costs. So it's something for us to consider as we develop our own API manufacturing capabilities on the African continent. So where are we now? At the moment, I think the pandemic has highlighted to us how fragile our healthcare systems are, and that we are still predominantly dependent, like I said, on late stage manufacturing and still API imports. In terms of vaccine manufacturing, we have seen the ramping up very quickly of our capacity with the latest BioVac announcement with their partnership with Pfizer, which I think is a very positive development. And last week we had the launch of the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing. Again, a very positive development where the heads of state have made a 20-year commitment to ramp up our local manufacturing capacity to 60%. That is now being limited again to fill and finish. But I think that we need to be aiming a lot higher than that. We need to be looking at how we invest in R&D. And I think Akebe talked about how R&D investment is so critical. And that brings us back to the education sector and what type of training we're providing. At the moment, we're losing a lot of intellectual capital to the Western world. And we need to look at how we can plug that brain drain. Because we can definitely look at solving our own public health issues if we are able to retain our African scientists and also make sure that our governments and policymakers are sticking to the commitment of spending 1% of GDP on R&D. At the moment, we are not meeting, there is no country on the continent that is meeting that commitment. So when we look at manufacturing capacity, we need to not look at it in isolation, but also look at it in alignment with our R&D objectives if we're really going to look at health security for the future. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you, and apologies again for pushing you to be very precise and focused. I have to apologize to all the participants for not being able to provide a space for Q&A as we wanted after these presentations because we have run out of time. And also present my apologies to UNCTAD because I know you had a time slot that was very precise and we are not respecting it quite, but we started a few minutes late, so I hope you will not take exception that we surpassed the time limit. The fact that we still have so many people participating and enjoying certainly the discussion, it's testimony to the quality of the presentations and the exchanges. I could see so many situations where we could enter into an exchange between what each one of the panelists said, because you picked on each other's contributions, and I'm not going to try to synthesize because it was very rich. But I'm very happy that Richard, you selected Africa as one of your topics, and the CFTA was given enough prominence for us to be able to dwell on some of the challenges that we'll have to face. The world has just become so complicated after the pandemic, and of course the launching of the CFTA could be seen from two angles. Could be seen as the wrong timing because of all the challenges that have been added to Africa, possibilities of increasing its participation in global trade, but more importantly, move in the direction of structural transformation. But we can also see it from a positive angle, that it has been a demonstration of quite a strong will on the part of the African leadership, but also of a number of other players in not losing momentum. It's not a coincidence that the official launch of the CFTA was in the middle of the pandemic, and the ratifications are still coming. So that's very encouraging, and it shows that we probably turn the page of some hesitation about the role that industrialization should play in Africa's transformation. And now it's more a question of the how. And we have covered part of the many challenges that we'll have to face in dealing with the how, but we are very grateful that you created the opportunity. Thank you.
Carlos, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And let me extend my thanks to you for agreeing to moderate this panel, and to once again thank all the presenters for what I think has been a very rich and interesting discussion, which I'm not even going to attempt to synthesize in any way. I'm reminded of a quote by a Marxist quote, Groucho Marx rather than Karl Marx, that time flies like an arrow and fruit flies like a banana. And I think we're reaching the time where the banana is taking on more importance, and it's getting late, and dinner time is approaching. So let me thank everybody and just remind you that the last of the series in this group of webinars will be, I think, on the 10th of September, which will bring together some work that we do with the OECD Development Center, which I think touches on a lot of what has been discussed here. We work with them on what we call production transformation policy reviews, which focuses in particular on getting more out of value chains, and particularly regional value chains, as being an important vehicle for individual countries to think about the way in which they can design and implement more effective industrial policies. And we will bring some of the participants in the different countries that we've run those policy reviews to the table to discuss about those issues from their point of view as policymakers. So I would encourage people also to look out for that event, which will be the last of this series. So let me thank again everybody. Let me thank AfCFTA, who particularly was instrumental in pushing us to organize these webinars. Let me give a special thanks to Jomo. It must be midnight in Malaysia, so I very much appreciate Jomo sticking around for this. For this webinar, and it's nice to see him again as well. So thank you to everybody, and have a good evening or end of the day wherever you are. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Richard, and everybody.
Thank you.